In the 21st century, virtually every country on earth is pulled in different directions. On one hand, we see that the countries of the world are under pressure to unite into a greater whole, at least economically speaking. They're pulled by the centripetal force towards some kind of center. This center can be regional center, or it can be a global center. So that countries of the world are increasingly joining economic blocs, and at the same time they are also joining the global economic arrangements, particularly the WTO, the World Trade Organization. At the same time as the countries are under pressure to merge economically, they're also under pressure to break up by the centrifugal forces of ethnocultural conflict. That is to say, ethnocultural conflict is fragmenting countries and making multiple countries out of single countries, whereas the centripetal forces of economic unity pull countries together into greater economic wholes. So the end result is that the countries are pulled into two opposite directions with some very interesting consequences. Let's talk about economic blocs first. Regional economic blocs are legion. There are many of them. We'll look at four most important ones: MERCORSUR, ASEAN, NAFTA, and the European Union. MERCORSUR is an economic bloc which includes countries of South America. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela are full members. It also has associate members: Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Suriname. These countries came together because they believed that they have to reduce barriers to trade on a regional basis before they would cooperate globally or cooperate with other economic blocs or even join other economic blocs like NAFTA. So the goal of this bloc and other goals and other blocs is to reduce barriers to trade. This is a common theme that runs through all of these economic blocs. Now, what are barriers to trade? Anything that makes international trade more difficult. For example, tariffs, that is to say taxes on imported goods, are an impediment to international trade. Also, quotas on the number of items that you can import. That's another barrier to trade. Labor and environmental standards can also serve as barriers to trade. If one country says, your environmental standards are not up to par, and we believe the products that you are making contain unacceptable elements like lead, and we are not going to accept them into our country. Labor standards can also be a reason, or at least a pretext, for trying to limit international trade. A country might say, your products are not particularly welcome here because we object to the labor practices that you use. Perhaps we have discovered that you use child labor, or perhaps we have discovered that you pay your workers less than we believe is fair wage. Safety regulations can also be a barrier to trade. And so a country might say, we're not going to allow trucks from your country into our country to make deliveries. For example, the United States could say to Mexico, we do not want Mexican trucks to come in because we do not believe them to be up to safety standards. So you can see how safety, labor, and environmental regulations can on the surface be just that, just regulations, but in actuality they can also be barriers to international trade, and the countries can use them as an excuse not to allow foreign goods in. So we discussed MERCOSUR. ASEAN is another economic bloc which was formed in 1967, and the original members were Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Then Brunei joined in 1984, and then in the 1990s, Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar also joined. Cambodia was the last one to join in the 1990s. It joined in April of 1999. Originally, ASEAN meant to connect the economies of Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand so as to serve as a counterbalance to the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China was a communist country, not just in name as it is today, but also in reality. And so, in order to better resist its influence and to resist falling under the sway of communist ideology, these countries put together this regional economic bloc. And by the end of the second decade of the 21st century, this bloc has grown to encompass well over 600 million people and a significant chunk of the world economy. Given rapid economic growth in most of these countries and significant reforms that have been achieved since the 1990s, particularly in Malaysia and Vietnam, we see that ASEAN is likely to have a fairly bright future. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, connects the economies of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. This trilateral bloc was a matter of great controversy during the 2016 presidential elections, as on both sides of the political divide, Democrats and Republicans, Democrats particularly as was expressed in the campaign of Bernie Sanders, and on the Republican side by the eventual nominee Donald Trump, we saw a great deal of opposition to foreign trade, and specifically that opposition took form of resisting NAFTA. So after more than 2 decades of being in force, NAFTA has come under very serious pressure because people started saying that it costs the United States its jobs. Maybe it created greater amount of wealth overall, but because labor is so much cheaper in Mexico than in the United States has lost some jobs. The EU, or the European Union, is probably the best known economic bloc. It includes 28 countries, and in fact, it has gone by now well beyond an economic arrangement. It is also a political arrangement with pan-European institutions like the Council of Ministers, like the European Parliament, like the European Central Bank, which means that this bloc brings its member states closer together as almost into a single country, as opposed to merely an economic arrangement for the purpose of reducing barriers to trade. At first, European Economic Community merged with the European Committee on Cooperation on Atomic Energy in the 1950s, and gradually the bloc has extended to more and more countries, and gradually it expanded its mission from purely economic cooperation to being something like one country. Of course, some suggest that the very creation of the bloc had political goals in mind, and that the main goal from the beginning was to stop something like World War III on European soil. As we all know, both world wars, World War I and World War II, were extremely devastating and took the lives of over 70 million people. And these wars were fought around the globe, but some of the most vicious fighting took place on the European continent. And so governments of European countries post-World War II decided that it would be prudent to connect their economies in an ever closer union so as to minimize the risk of another world war in Europe. Now, of the 28 member states, some are much richer than others. Many members are relatively recent entrants, having entered the European Union in the 21st century. Bulgaria and Romania come to mind. And because the European Union connects most of the member states into a community that recognizes no political borders for the purpose of life, work, and travel and education, a citizen of one country like Romania or Bulgaria could move to another country which is a member of this arrangement known as the Schengen Area. Could move, for example, to Germany or to France and try to get a job there and get admittance to university, and all of this is perfectly legal. So this migration from poor EU members to rich EU members, as well as the migration from North Africa and the Middle East by refugees into EU member countries, has produced a significant reaction against the EU as a whole. Another reason why reaction against the EU as a whole has taken place is because the European Central Bank is basically established a common currency area, and 17 out of 28 member countries participate in common currency area. It turned out that this arrangement, in retrospect, we see was unwise because it does not allow poorer European countries to inflate their way out of their economic difficulties, particularly out of the excessive debt that they tend to have. So countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and most notably Greece, in the past, when there was no European Central Bank and no common European currency, they could print more money, more of their own money, and this would mean they would have higher rates of inflation than other European countries, but at least they would not be stuck in a hopeless dead-end situation when they couldn't repay their debt or when they could not meet salary demands for their government workers. With the advent of common currency, this tactic became impossible because it is the European Central Bank that regulates the supply of money in circulation. So because of this, some people said the European Union has gone too far, too fast. It should not have created common currency. Maybe it should not have even created the common Schengen Area for the purpose of work and education for member countries. This reaction has been so strong in recent years that Great Britain actually voted in June of 2016 to leave the European Union, having joined it in 1973. Now, Great Britain, like its neighboring country Ireland, has never been a member of the Schengen Area. That is to say, it never recognized lack of borders for the purpose of travel, work, and education. It maintained, and it also never participated in common currency. It always preserved the British pound. But nevertheless, even this limited participation as a member of the EU was too much for many people. And by a narrow margin in 2016, the British people, at a referendum, voted to leave the European Union. It's a remarkable event. So the reason why this is happening is immigration from poor European Union member states and from North Africa and the Middle East, and also a sense of economic betrayal. Some people have benefited from the EU and from the global economy very much, and others have been left behind. So those who have been left behind outnumber those who have actually benefited by it. So they are reacting against it. And if people of France and Holland and some other countries were given a choice whether to stay in the EU or to leave, at least some would decide as of 2016 to leave the EU, but the governments refused to allow them the vote to decide whether to leave or to stay. As an example, in Great Britain, both major parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, actually wanted Great Britain to stay in the European Union, and their politicians campaigned quite actively for staying in the EU, but the people still voted to leave. And almost certainly in France today, as of 2016, people probably would have voted to leave the EU if they were given a choice. Now, at the same time, rather, as countries are coming together in regional economic blocs, they're also cooperating on a global scale. The World Trade Organization, which was created in 1995 and is a successor to a series of so-called GATT rounds, negotiation rounds, by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The World Trade Organization encompasses the vast majority of the world's countries. And if you can see the map that I have here, all the countries in green and in blue are full members of the World Trade Organization. And the countries in this kind of light green or yellowish color, they are observer countries. And only the ones that are in red are not members of the World Trade Organization. So virtually every country on earth is a member. And the purpose of WTO is to settle trade disputes between countries, and in the process to promote reduction to trade, reduction of barriers to international trade. So we see globalism, economic globalism, being realized more and more through the WTO, which is why for many years now, for about 20 years now, there has been a strong reaction against it, particularly from young people who are idealistic and for people who have been left behind by international trade, saying that this economic arrangement disenfranchises ordinary workers who have no control over their jobs, living for foreign markets where labor is much, much cheaper. And in the coming years, in the 21st century, we are liable to see a continuation of this reaction as incomes, particularly in rich countries, stagnate, and as companies feel pressure to deliver ever greater profits at increasing rates of profits. This pushes them to outsource abroad as much as they possibly can. So, while countries of the world are being brought together economically, they're brought together in a way that benefits corporations, multinational corporations, and that benefits those who are stakeholders, who have investments in these corporations, that benefits boards of directors of these corporations, chief executive officers, and other executives of these corporations, but does not necessarily benefit ordinary laborers. And one of the problems going forward into the 21st century will remain this conflict between labor, which wants higher wages and more stability, more certainty, and the investor class, which wants to maximize profits at an ever faster rate. The results of this conflict are not fully predictable, but it is clear already, as was illustrated during the 2016 presidential campaign in the United States and during the Brexit phenomenon in Europe. It is clear that the people have become more restive than ever before and are pressuring their political leaders to limit globalization and to do something that would benefit their country first, rather than generate the greatest possible amount of global wealth. Thank you.